September 1943. The train carrying Japanese prisoners of war rolled through the dense forests of Washington state, its windows revealing a landscape so impossibly green and abundant that Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto pressed his face against the glass in disbelief. Behind him, 37 other captured soldiers sat in silence, their minds still trapped in the hell of Attu Island, where they had surrendered after weeks of starvation and disease. They expected execution, or at minimum the brutal treatment their own military had promised American captives would receive. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of these men could have imagined was that within months they would be writing letters home, begging their families to join them in America, or that some would refuse repatriation when the conflict ended. The Fort Lewis Processing Center smelled of disinfectant and fresh paint. Captain Robert Morrison of the Military Intelligence Service stood at attention as the Japanese prisoners filed off the train, their uniforms tattered, faces hollow from malnutrition. Morrison had studied in Tokyo before the conflict, spoke fluent Japanese, and understood the cultural context that would make the next few hours critically important. He had read the intelligence reports, the intercepted documents that revealed what Japanese soldiers had been taught about American captivity. They expected torture, they expected death. Some had attempted to take their own lives rather than face the shame of surrender. Morrison approached the first prisoner, a man whose uniform markings indicated he had been a sergeant. The man stood rigidly, eyes fixed forward, body trembling slightly. Morrison spoke in Japanese, his tone calm and respectful. Then Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka said nothing in response. His mind raced with confusion. The American officer had just asked if he was hungry, not demanded information, not threatened consequences, simply asked about food. Tanaka had been trained that surrender meant dishonor worse than death, that American forces showed no mercy to prisoners. Yet this officer stood before him, speaking his language with a proper accent, asking about his basic needs. The processing began with medical examinations. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese-American physician who had volunteered specifically for this duty, worked with translator efficiency and genuine concern. She documented weights, diseases, injuries with clinical precision while maintaining an almost maternal gentleness. Private Yamamoto found himself examined by a female doctor, something almost inconceivable in his military experience, and she discovered he had tuberculosis, along with severe malnutrition and infected wounds on his feet. Chen prescribed immediate treatment, rest, and a carefully calibrated diet to prevent refeeding syndrome. Then Yamamoto said, "Thank you," in broken English, the first words he had spoken since capture. Chen smiled and responded in Japanese, telling him he would recover here, that he was safe now. The camp itself defied everything the prisoners had been taught. Located near the small town of Pullman, the facility consisted of clean barracks, a medical building, mess halls, and recreation areas. The prisoners were assigned to rooms with real beds, given clean uniforms, and provided with toiletries. That first night, dinner consisted of rice, vegetables, meat, and fruit, portions that seemed impossibly large to men who had been surviving on grass and boot leather on Attu. Sergeant Tanaka sat at a table in the mess hall, staring at his tray. Around him, other prisoners ate slowly, mechanically, their faces showing the same confusion and disbelief. One man began to weep silently, overwhelmed by the simple act of eating real food. Another asked if this was a trick, if the Americans were fattening them up before some terrible punishment. The truth was far more complex and rooted in both pragmatism and idealism. The United States military had decided that proper treatment of Japanese prisoners served multiple strategic purposes. It could provide valuable intelligence through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. It could undermine enemy propaganda that painted Americans as barbaric. It could demonstrate American values even in wartime. And perhaps most importantly for the long term, it could plant seeds of understanding that might matter in whatever world emerged after the conflict ended. Morrison had argued passionately for this approach in his reports to Washington, and now he was responsible for implementing it. The first week passed in a haze of recovery and confusion for the prisoners. They received medical treatment, dental care, and adequate nutrition for the first time in months. They were allowed to write letters home, though these were censored. They were not forced to work, though labor opportunities were offered for those who wanted to earn small amounts of money. Most significantly, they were treated with a baseline of human dignity that contradicted everything they had been taught about their fate as prisoners. Yamamoto spent those first days in the medical ward, receiving treatment for his tuberculosis. The nurse who cared for him, a stern-faced woman named Margaret Sullivan, brought him books in Japanese, checked his temperature with genuine concern, and scolded him when he tried to get out of bed before doctor's approval. He found himself thinking about his mother, wondering what she would think of this strange American woman who treated him like a sick child rather than an enemy soldier. The psychological transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. Tanaka, who had been appointed by Morrison as a liaison between the camp administration and the prisoners, found himself in an impossible position. He was responsible for communicating rules and resolving disputes, but this role required him to acknowledge that the American system was fair, that the treatment was genuine. Every day brought new evidence that challenged his worldview. When a prisoner became seriously ill, American doctors worked through the night to save him. When fights broke out between prisoners from different units, American guards separated them, but imposed no harsh punishments. When requests were made for religious items or specific foods, efforts were made to accommodate them. The camp library became an unexpected catalyst for change. It contained books in Japanese, newspapers, magazines, and educational materials. The prisoners could read about American history, democracy, agriculture, and technology. Some of these materials were clearly intended as subtle propaganda, emphasizing American abundance and freedom. But mixed in were genuine educational resources that treated readers as intelligent adults capable of forming their own conclusions. Corporal Kenji Sato, a former schoolteacher, spent hours in the library each day. He read about the American Constitution, about the history of immigration, about agricultural techniques used in Washington state. He wrote in letters home that were later intercepted, describing his amazement at the availability of information, the encouragement to learn and question. The agricultural work program began in spring of 1944. Washington faced severe labor shortages as American men served overseas and women took factory jobs. Local farmers needed help with planting, and the prisoners needed productive activity. The program was voluntary, with prisoners paid 50 cents a day for their labor. Morrison had worried that no one would volunteer, that pride would prevent cooperation. Instead, over half the prisoners signed up immediately. The work was hard but familiar, and it got them outside the camp fence into the extraordinary landscape of eastern Washington. Yamamoto, recovered from tuberculosis, found himself assigned to a wheat farm owned by a man named Thomas Eriksson. Eriksson was a third-generation Norwegian-American farmer in his 60s, too old for military service but deeply patriotic. His two sons were fighting in Europe. He had no reason to show kindness to Japanese prisoners, but he was also a practical man who needed help bringing in his crop. The first day, Eriksson demonstrated how he wanted the work done, then stepped back and watched Yamamoto and 3 other prisoners work. Their efficiency surprised him, their knowledge of agriculture evident. At lunch, Eriksson's wife brought food to the field, sandwiches and lemonade, and she served the prisoners the same portions as everyone else. Over the weeks that followed, an unlikely relationship developed. Eriksson taught the prisoners American farming techniques, showed them his machinery, explained his crop rotation system. In return, they shared Japanese methods for dealing with pests and maximizing yield in difficult conditions. Eriksson's English and the prisoners' limited vocabulary made detailed conversation difficult, but they communicated through demonstration and shared work. One afternoon, Eriksson showed Yamamoto a photograph of his sons in uniform. Yamamoto understood. He took out a worn photograph of his own family in Osaka. They stood together in the wheat field, 2 fathers whose sons were trying to destroy each other somewhere across the Pacific, looking at pictures of their children. The camp began to develop its own culture, a strange hybrid of military discipline and civilian routine. Prisoners organized classes teaching English, American history, and vocational skills. They formed baseball teams and played against each other, and occasionally against American service teams. They created a garden where they grew vegetables using techniques from home, producing more than the camp could use and selling the surplus to help fund improvements. They published a camp newspaper that mixed news, poetry, and practical information. Morrison watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride that the experiment was working, that these men were rebuilding their sense of purpose and dignity. Sadness, because he knew that everything they were learning and experiencing would make their eventual return home more complicated. The letters began to arrive in Japan in mid-1944, censored but still remarkable. Families opened envelopes expecting brief confirmations of survival. Instead, they found pages of description about America, about abundance and opportunity, about respectful treatment and hope for the future. Yamamoto wrote to his mother describing the Erickson farm, the vast fields of wheat, the machinery that could do the work of 100 men. He wrote about Mrs. Erickson's kindness, about learning English, about his hope that someday she might visit America. His mother, reading this letter in their small Osaka apartment while sirens wailed warning of American bombers overhead, could not reconcile her son's words with the reality of her daily life. She wrote back carefully, knowing her letter would be censored, telling him that she was glad he was safe, but reminding him of his duty to the emperor and his family honor. The disconnect between the prisoners' experience and their family's reality created profound psychological stress. The men in the camp lived in safety and relative comfort, while their loved ones endured bombing raids, starvation, and increasing militarization of Japanese society. Letters from home described destroyed neighborhoods, food shortages, and the constant pressure of wartime propaganda. The prisoners felt guilt for their good fortune, shame for their surrender, and growing anxiety about what return would mean. Some stopped writing home. Others wrote with increasing desperation, trying to convey truths they knew would be rejected or misunderstood. A few began to express in their letters a thought that was almost treasonous, that perhaps there was something to learn from American society, perhaps the propaganda about American barbarism had been wrong about many things. As 1944 turned to 1945, the nature of the camp evolved. The prisoners had been captive for nearly 2 years now. Many had learned substantial English. Most had worked extensively in the surrounding community. All had experienced consistent treatment that contradicted their indoctrination. Morrison received authorization to expand educational programs and to increase interaction with the local community. Selected prisoners began attending classes at Washington State College in Pullman, studying agriculture and engineering under guard, but as students rather than prisoners. This was unprecedented, and it generated significant controversy both within the military and in the civilian population. Tanaka found himself walking across a college campus, surrounded by American students who mostly ignored him. He sat in a lecture hall learning about soil composition and irrigation systems. The professor, an elderly man named Henderson, treated Tanaka exactly like his other students, calling on him to answer questions, providing feedback on his work, expecting the same standards of performance. After class one day, Henderson asked Tanaka to stay for a moment. He wanted to know what Tanaka planned to do with this education. Tanaka explained honestly that he did not know, that eventually he would be returned to Japan, that this knowledge might never be used. Henderson nodded slowly. Then he said that knowledge was never wasted, that understanding how to feed people would always be valuable, that perhaps someday Tanaka would help rebuild whatever came after this terrible conflict. Tanaka thought about this conversation for weeks. It had never occurred to him that an American might think about Japanese rebuilding, might imagine a future beyond victory and defeat. The local community's reaction to the prisoner labor program was mixed and evolved over time. Initially, many residents of Pullman and surrounding towns opposed having Japanese prisoners work alongside civilians. They had sons and husbands fighting in the Pacific. They had seen newsreels of atrocities. The presence of enemy soldiers, even captured ones, felt like a betrayal. But economic necessity and daily exposure gradually changed many minds. Farmers who employed prisoner labor found them hard-working and skilled. Shop owners who saw prisoners making purchases with their small wages found them polite and respectful. Teachers who had prisoners in their classes found them serious students. Slowly, individual relationships began to form that transcended propaganda and nationality. One of the most significant relationships developed between Yamamoto and the Eriksson family. By spring of 1945, Yamamoto had worked on their farm for nearly a year. He ate lunch with the family most days. He learned enough English to have simple conversations. He met their neighbors and church friends. One Sunday, the Erikssons invited Yamamoto to attend church with them. This required special permission from Morrison, and it generated significant controversy in the congregation. Yamamoto sat in the back pew, understanding almost nothing of the service but observing everything. The hymns sounded beautiful. The pastor spoke about peace and forgiveness. After the service, some congregants avoided eye contact, but others shook his hand, welcomed him. An elderly woman, learning he was from Osaka, told him she had visited Japan before the conflict and loved its beauty and culture. She hoped to return someday. Yamamoto felt tears in his eyes for the first time since his capture. These people, whose country was at war with his, could still see him as human, could still imagine peace and reconciliation. The announcement of Germany's surrender in May 1945 caused complicated reactions in the camp. It meant the conflict was closer to ending. But it also meant all Allied resources could now focus on the Pacific. The prisoners understood what this meant for Japan. The strategic situation was hopeless. American industrial capacity was beyond anything they had imagined possible. The bombing campaigns were devastating Japanese cities. Yet official Japanese propaganda insisted on continued resistance, on the righteousness of their cause, on ultimate victory. The disconnect between reality and rhetoric became impossible to ignore. Tanaka called a meeting of the prisoner leadership. They discussed what they knew, what they feared, what they hoped. Some argued for maintaining traditional loyalty regardless of circumstances. Others suggested that true loyalty might mean preserving Japanese lives and culture by acknowledging reality. A few, including Yamamoto, wondered aloud whether they had a responsibility to share what they had learned about America, to counter the propaganda that had shaped their understanding. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 reached the camp through American newspapers. The prisoners read about the new weapon, about the instant destruction of cities, about Japan's imminent surrender. They also read American editorials debating the morality and necessity of the bombings. This was shocking in itself, that Americans publicly questioned their own government's decisions, that newspapers printed dissenting opinions. The discussions in the camp became heated and emotional. Some prisoners felt vindicated in their earlier surrender, arguing that continued resistance had always been futile. Others felt deep shame and anger that Japan had been brought so low. All felt profound grief for the civilians who had suffered. Yamamoto learned that Osaka had been heavily bombed before the atomic weapons were used. He had no way of knowing if his family had survived. He sat in his barracks room, holding the worn photograph, wondering if his mother was alive, if their home still existed. Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, should have been a moment of celebration for the prisoners. Instead, it brought an identity crisis. They were no longer enemy combatants, but they were not yet free men. They were Japanese nationals who had been defeated, but they had spent 2 years living in America, learning American ways, developing relationships with Americans. Many had written letters expressing admiration for aspects of American society. Some had privately acknowledged that they had been misled by their own government's propaganda. Now they faced the prospect of returning to a devastated Japan, where their surrender would be seen as shameful, where their positive experiences in America might be viewed as betrayal. Morrison watched his charges struggle with these questions and felt genuine concern for their futures. The repatriation process began slowly. Japan was under occupation, its infrastructure destroyed, its economy collapsed. There was no rush to return prisoners who were healthy, fed, and productively employed. Some prisoners began requesting permission to stay in America, to work on the farms where they had been laboring, to continue their education. These requests created legal and diplomatic complications. They were technically enemy nationals without immigration status, but they were also individuals who had demonstrated good character and had skills that could contribute to American society. Morrison began making the case to his superiors that selective permission should be granted, at least temporarily, for prisoners who wanted to remain and had American sponsors willing to vouch for them. Yamamoto made his decision in October of 1945. He approached Morrison and requested permission to stay in America if the Eriksons would sponsor him. He wanted to finish his education, to learn more about modern agriculture, to build a new life in this country that had shown him unexpected mercy. Morrison asked if he understood what this would mean, the complications with his family, the questions about his loyalty, the uncertain legal status. Yamamoto replied that he understood perfectly, but that he had also learned that sometimes the most honorable choice was the one that looked toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. Morrison promised to submit the request and to advocate for it, though he warned that approval was far from certain. They shook hands, Japanese and American, former enemies now working together toward an uncertain future. The Eriksons were initially surprised by the request, but ultimately supportive. Thomas Erikson wrote a letter to the authorities explaining that Yamamoto had proven himself to be hard-working, honest, and skilled, that he had become almost like a member of their family, that they would welcome him staying and continuing to work their farm. This letter, from a man whose sons had fought against Japan, carried significant weight. Mrs. Erikson added her own note describing Yamamoto's character, his kindness, his willingness to learn and adapt. She wrote that their sons had returned home safely, and that perhaps the best way to honor their service was to build bridges rather than maintaining hatred. Over the following months, approximately 17 of the prisoners from the Pullman camp received permission to remain in America under special provisions. Each required an American sponsor and had to demonstrate plans for education or employment. Each had to navigate complex bureaucratic processes and public skepticism. But each represented a quiet revolution in how enemies could become neighbors, how propaganda could be overcome by personal experience, how individuals could choose their own paths despite historical forces. Yamamoto was among those approved. He continued working on the Erikson farm while taking classes at Washington State College. He wrote carefully worded letters to his mother explaining his decision, trying to convey that this was not betrayal, but hope, not abandonment, but opportunity. The responses from Japan were mixed and painful. Yamamoto's mother wrote back after a long silence, her letter brief and formal. She expressed that she was alive, that their home had been damaged but not destroyed, that she was glad he was safe. But she also made clear her disappointment in his choice to remain in America. To her and to many in Japan, his decision looked like a rejection of everything Japanese, an acceptance of defeat that went beyond military surrender to cultural capitulation. Yamamoto understood her perspective. He had been raised with the same values, the same sense of duty and honor. But he had also experienced something that changed his understanding of those concepts. He had learned that honor could include acknowledging when you had been wrong, that duty could mean building rather than destroying, that loyalty to your culture did not require rejecting everything about another culture. The prisoners who returned to Japan faced their own challenges. Many found that their time in America had marked them as different, suspect. The stories they told of their treatment were often dismissed as impossible, or as evidence that they had been brainwashed. Some were questioned repeatedly about why they had not chosen to take their own lives rather than surrender. The knowledge and skills they had gained in America were sometimes seen as contaminated by association with the enemy. Tanaka, who had served as liaison and had developed genuine respect for American systems, found himself marginalized in post-war Japan. He eventually emigrated to Brazil, unable to reconcile his experience with the reality he found at home. The impact of the prisoner of war program extended far beyond the individual lives it touched. It demonstrated that even in wartime, there were alternatives to dehumanization and brutality. It showed that investment in humane treatment could yield strategic benefits through intelligence gathering and psychological operations. It proved that individuals could transcend propaganda and national enmity through personal relationships and direct experience. Most significantly, it planted seeds that would grow into the US-Japan alliance that emerged in the post-war period. The prisoners who stayed in America became living bridges between cultures. Those who returned carried memories and knowledge that influenced reconstruction and reconciliation. Yamamoto completed his degree in agriculture in 1949 and became an American citizen in 1952. He continued working with the Ericksons until Thomas passed away in 1957, then purchased his own farm with savings and a loan that the Erickson family helped secure. He married a Japanese-American woman whose family had been interned during the conflict, a woman who understood complicated loyalties and difficult choices. They raised 3 children who grew up American, but with deep appreciation for their Japanese heritage. Yamamoto never stopped writing to his mother, though her responses remained formal and infrequent until her death in 1962. He visited Japan once in the 1970s, walking through Osaka, seeing how the city had been rebuilt, feeling like both native and foreigner simultaneously. In his later years, Yamamoto occasionally spoke to schools and community groups about his experience as a prisoner of war. He emphasized that his story was unusual, that many prisoners suffered terribly in many conflicts, that he did not want to minimize the real horrors of warfare. But he also insisted that his experience mattered precisely because it showed what was possible when people chose to see enemies as human beings, when nations made strategic calculations that included mercy and long-term thinking, when individuals had courage to question what they had been taught and to make difficult choices. He would show the old photograph of his mother, tell about the first meal in the camp, describe the Erickson family and their farm, talk about the moment he decided to stay. His audiences often asked if he regretted his choice. He would pause, considering, then say that regret was too simple a word for something so complex. He had gained a life but lost connection to his homeland. He had found opportunity but at the cost of family ties. He had escaped the devastation of post-war Japan but carried guilt about that escape. Yet given the same circumstances, knowing everything he knew now, he believed he would make the same choice. The story of Japanese prisoners in Washington state remained relatively obscure for decades. It did not fit neat narratives about the conflict, about heroism and villainy, about us versus them. It suggested uncomfortable truths about propaganda on all sides, about the randomness of fate that determined who became enemy and who became friend, about the possibility of connection even in the midst of hatred. The letters that prisoners wrote home, the ones where they expressed amazement at their treatment, and even suggested they preferred not to leave, were declassified decades after the conflict ended. Historians studying them found evidence of something remarkable, proof that warfare need not destroy every human bond, that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals could choose paths toward understanding rather than vengeance. The Pullman camp closed in 1946, its barracks eventually demolished, the land returned to other uses. Few physical traces remain of the facility that housed those 38 prisoners, but the impact ripples forward in descendants, in changed perspectives, in the accumulated choices of individuals who experienced something unexpected and let it change them. The prisoners who stayed in America contributed to their adopted country's agriculture, business, and culture. Their children and grandchildren became doctors, teachers, engineers, artists. The Erickson family farm continued for 2 more generations before being sold to a development company. But visitors to the area can still see wheat fields stretching to the horizon, still imagine prisoners and farmers working side by side, still sense the possibility that existed even in wartime. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.